You're watching Capital City Sunday.
Tuesday was the first hearing of the new legislative session, and Republicans are working quickly to move through the legislature a proposal that seeks to enshrine voter ID laws in the state's constitution. Its co-authors argue the push to get this referendum question on the April ballot is to ensure the Wisconsin Supreme Court's now liberal majority cannot overturn the law. Joining me now is Democratic Senator Kelda Roys. Senator Roys, thank you so much for joining us on the show this morning.
Thanks for having me, Darielle.
Senator Roys, Joint Resolution 2, your thoughts on this proposal and what were your concerns in how this proposal was brought forward?
Well, I'm concerned that Senate Republicans seem to be focused on restricting people's rights instead of addressing the needs that Wisconsinites face every day. Democrats are looking at trying to lower health care costs, child care costs, housing, dealing with the challenges that our constituents are facing. Meanwhile, Republicans seem to be just reverting to their old playbook of power grabs, trying to cement their own power, which is really what this is about.
And this proposal is already on its way to passing through the Assembly next week. What would you have to say if voters ultimately approve this referendum?
Well, I think we should be very careful about amending the Constitution. One thing that we've learned as we've had this voter ID requirement law in place for over 10 years, or for almost 10 years now, is that there are thousands of Wisconsinites who are legal, eligible voters that have found it impossible to vote under the current law. And I think we should be making it more convenient and easier for people to vote and participate, not harder. And it doesn't really matter who you vote for, but everyone should be able to exercise their legal right to vote. This constitutional amendment is going to make it harder for voters whose rights have been violated to have their day in court. To me, that's really undemocratic, and it just shows how desperate the Republicans are to prevent people from protecting their rights and from making their voices heard.
Senator Royce, I did have a chance to speak with Senator Van Wanggaard following Wednesday's vote. He did say he'd be willing to consider potential solutions to some of those barriers that you spoke about earlier in the conversation, like transportation, that Democrats are concerned about. Could Democrats potentially get behind this proposal if Republicans revisit some of those barriers?
Well, I think Democrats would certainly welcome the opportunity to make sure that people are not disenfranchised. We all deserve the freedom to vote, and the government should be facilitating that and not impeding it. Unfortunately, what we know is that this proposal has been put forth by Republicans, not just here in Wisconsin, but nationwide, as an effort to try to make it harder for people, and especially students and especially the elderly, to vote. So I'll believe it when I see it. We know this from sworn testimony about what happened in the caucus rooms when these bills were initially under consideration. They are put in place to make it harder for people to vote. And so I don't think that the Republicans are going to change their position on that. But if they do, certainly I'd love to make it possible so that anyone with any type of photo ID, even if it's from another state, even if you don't drive anymore and you have an expired driver's license, it still proves who you are. You should be able to use it.
One of the arguments that Democrats made during testimony on Wednesday was that there are more important issues facing Wisconsinites that Republicans could have brought forward. But Republicans made the argument, including Senator Wanggaard, that Democrats have not introduced any proposals so far this session. You guys spoke about child care counts. You spoke about gun safety measures that could have been introduced. Could Democrats have brought proposals forward heading into Wednesday's floor session?
Well, we actually have rules in the legislature that allow for public input. So you need to circulate a bill. You need to give legislators a period of time to review it. Then it's introduced. Then it's referred to a committee. Then the committee chair basically decides to hold a hearing on it. All of that can take weeks or even months. And in some cases, of course, committee chairs never hold hearings on bills, like if the bill is authored by a Democrat. So we believe in public input. And when you've got, the ink is not even dry on our inauguration, it is, I think, very cynical of the Republicans to be forcing this through so quickly. The only reason they are doing it is they want to make sure that it's on the April ballot because they're trying to goose turnout for their right-wing Supreme Court candidate. Brad Schimmel, who was someone who spent his time as Attorney General ignoring rape kits as they sat untested, and hiring people that were trying to scheme to overturn Roe versus Wade. So they want to do everything that they can to help their guy win the Supreme Court, flip the Supreme Court back to conservative control so that they can re-rig Wisconsin and put back in place gerrymandered maps. That's really what this is about.
Obviously, this is one priority for legislative Republicans this session. Assembly Speaker Robin Vos spoke about the Department of Public Instruction's changes to test standards also being a top issue, a tax cut. What are some of the priorities for Democrats that we are going to see this session?
Well, I think Democrats are relentlessly focused on making sure that Wisconsin families can thrive. That means we're lowering costs for the things that are the most important: housing, health care, childcare, prescription drugs. Democrats also want to make sure people's rights are protected. Unlike Republicans, we don't want to see abortion banned. We don't want to make it harder for people to access birth control or voting. We want to make sure that people have the opportunity to live and build families and have a successful life here in Wisconsin. We want to make sure our public schools are fully funded. Republicans have spent decades defunding local governments and public schools, but what they're doing is forcing us to raise our own property taxes. Average Wisconsinites are seeing their property taxes bills higher by hundreds of dollars this year, and it is a direct result of Republicans in the state legislature refusing to do their job of funding those essential public services. So if we want to keep the lights on in our kids' schools, if we want to keep teachers employed, if we want to keep our streets clean, then we have got to have state funding for those things. Otherwise, we're going to have to continue to see our property taxes skyrocket the way that Republicans have forced.
Democratic Governor Tony Evers announced last week he plans to include a citizen-led referendum process as part of his 2025 to 2027 biannual budget. Republicans in leadership have already rejected the idea, but I want to get your response as a Democrat. What do you think about that proposal?
Well, I think the people's voices should be heard in a democracy, so it's a good idea to have citizen initiatives and referendums. At the same time, I think we know that Republicans are unwilling to do anything that will lessen their grip on power. We're still dealing with the after effects of 15 years of gerrymandering, and so Republicans are going to use this next session, which is the last one that they're going to have unified control, to try to put anything in place that makes it harder for people to make their voices heard.
Democratic Senator Kelda Roys. Senator Roys, again, thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure.